Welcome to the Infinite Women podcast. I'm your host, Allison Tyra, and today I'm joined by Dorina Pojani, Associate Professor of Urban Planning at the University of Queensland and co-author of Early Planning Utopias, A Feminist Critique, which is available now from Anthem Press. Now, urban planning is one of those areas that a lot of people don't necessarily realize is often gendered. And as always, not to women's benefit. So, can you give us a sense of the ways that this plays out?
This is a growing area of research, the connection between gender and urban planning and specific areas of urban planning, for example, gender and housing or gender and our transport systems, how women use those and how they respond or don't respond to women's needs. So the patriarchy is manifested in urban planning, sometimes in small ways. For example, sidewalks not being designed with the needs of the mother that's pushing a stroller in mind, or not being designed with the needs of older women in mind that might be using a walker or they need longer street crossing signals. And men have those issues too, of course, but women live longer, so we're older for a longer time. All genders are young the same amount of time, but then women end up being older for longer. So then we have to cope with this gender unfriendly city for longer. Those are the sort of daily aspects of the patriarchy in urban planning, sort of the nitty gritty. But my critique is broader. As a feminist planner, I say, well, we need to look at how the planning authority itself is structured, and how the whole idea of urban governance um, is structured. And in my view, it's all very gendered in the sense that urban governance is patriarchal, right? Even national governance is patriarchal. There is usually some leader at the top. At the national level, that leader is often a man, but at the city level, leaders are often men as well. I mean, we're starting to have more female mayors, but it's often the case that mayors are men. And then it goes down from their city council, etc., all the way down to the small person. So governance is not structured in a horizontal, consensus-based way. It's structured based on a hierarchy. So now you can say, well, how does that connect to the patriarchy? Well, that's the very concept of the patriarchal family, right? There is the father at the top, the triangle, and then the mother is underneath the father, and then there is the children. Male children are more important. Female children are less important. That's been the traditional structure of the patriarchal family. And so we've taken those structures and I feel we've translated them into urban governance and national governance.
At the time we're recording this, I was recently in Canberra, which for anybody outside Australia who hasn't been to Canberra, it's our national capital, and it is fundamentally not well designed as a city, in my opinion. I mean, you are obviously much more qualified to speak on this, but by which I mean that it is fundamentally not walkable. The public transportation is not great. It's in sort of that cycle where people don't use the public transport because it's not great, but then they don't invest in the public transport because people don't use it. And so it just sort of keeps feeding itself. And what struck me when you were talking about, the woman with a walker or with a stroller, those are very much ableism issues as well. And the friend that I was staying with in Canberra, when I complained about, I'm trying to get around and it's just not easy, it's not quick, and if I wasn't as able-bodied as I am, it wouldn't really be feasible. And she said, "Oh, well, it's fine as long as you have a car." And I had to point out a lot of people don't have cars. So you're getting classism in there as well. And so obviously, yes, it's gendered, but there's also all of these other factors when the people running things are, financially secure, able-bodied, typically, white men. You can see the ways that they're making decisions do not serve anyone who doesn't have all of these many privileges.
Yeah, that's a very interesting example you mentioned, Canberra, and of course, I completely agree. There is a lot of intersectionality at play there. So when we look at gender, we need to look at how it interacts with disability or ability, how it interacts with social class. So there are women sort of higher status women in terms of socioeconomics that might fare better in the city than poorer men. That's for sure. So when we talk about gender, we talk about general trends, but then there is so many gradations within that. We need to look at race as well. That plays out in different ways. Black women as opposed to white women, or black women, black men, that kind of thing. But Canberra is an interesting example because it's an example of an early new capital city. It's more than 100 years old now and is one of few new capitals that was actually designed with the collaboration of a woman. So it was a husband and wife couple that worked on the project. They were both American. The man was called Walter Burley Griffin, for those that don't know the history of Canberra, and his wife was Marion Mahoney Griffin. And at the time when Canberra was built, she was completely overshadowed by her husband. He was considered the expert, and he was formally involved in the capital city design, and he was part of the administration. But later, her work on Canberra was rediscovered. There was some talk about how even them winning the project, getting the commission, they came from Chicago, they moved to Australia from Chicago, but getting the commission had a lot to do with her drawings. They were so attractive. And she was a very well-educated woman. I mean, she was an MIT graduate. And yeah, it wasn't until later that people started to realize the importance of her work. And we do need to keep in mind that the city that they designed initially was a lot more walkable, more compact than what eventually got built. I mean, it was still sort of meant to be grand and ceremonial and all these things that aren't necessarily um, human friendly, or they don't necessarily align with feminist planning concepts, but still it was a lot better, yeah, a whole cut above what eventually got built. What got built was primarily the work of a series of male administrators that took over the project after the Griffins left. They just couldn't cope with the bureaucracy and the political fighting. And then it was a series of male bureaucrats that kept designing Canberra, and they left us with a messy legacy. What we have today as a capital city.
I have to shout out that Marion Mahoney Griffin also worked very closely for many years with Frank Lloyd Wright, who was notorious for stealing the work of the people in his studio. So we don't know exactly how much of his work was actually her work because of those factors, but the evidence that we do have strongly indicates that she was very influential, shall we say, in what we think
Absolutely.
of as Frank Lloyd Wright style. So
Absolutely. And she ended up being overshadowed by these men, her husband and Frank Lloyd Wright. And from what I understand from planning history, um, Wright had sort of this big fallout with the both of them when they got this big Canberra commission. He wasn't too happy to have this competition.
So we can see how even if the plan is a certain way, the actual implementation obviously is not that way. And obviously cities evolve. So even a relatively young city like Canberra, by which I mean it's young compared to, I mean, even Sydney or Melbourne, but particularly cities like London or Paris, if we're talking about capital cities, these cities evolve over time. And so in your book, you and your co-authors are tracing the issues that we still see today back through history.
Yes, yes. So what happens is, to provide a bit of background, there has always been some planning. along human civilization. For as long as there have been settlements that we can consider cities or towns, there's been some planning involved. So in a sense, planning is the oldest profession. It might be as old as, I don't know, medicine, because people have always needed to figure out some way to lay out their circulation paths and housing, etc. However, planning as we know it today is a formalized discipline separate from architecture and separate from public health or engineering, did not emerge until the late 19th century during the period that's generally considered the Second Industrial Revolution. And so some planning back then emerged out of public health concerns that were becoming quite major because of all these factories that were cropping up in cities. The air was so polluted, the water was filthy, roads were dirty, and so on and so forth. And there was a mass of poor industrial workers that had moved to cities from the countryside, and their housing conditions were often appalling. So that was one crowd. But then there was also another crowd driven more by aesthetic concerns that worked in planning around that era, late 19th century, early 20th century. And they saw the cities as being degraded by industry. So there were these beautiful cities that had been designed as total works of art, but now with industry, these train lines were cutting across cities. So now we're always promoting, train transport and bus transport, this infrastructure. But when it was invented in the 19th century, it was considered as very disruptive, as very anti-human. The introduction of trains and tram lines in cities. They were noisy. I mean, there were these scary machines. So there were these two crowds, but then there were also all these commercial interests at the time that pushed for planning regulation. We need to remember that land had not been a commodity. While there were aristocracies in Europe, you couldn't buy and sell land. So land got passed wholesale from a landowner, major landowner, to his firstborn son. It didn't get split up into pieces. Often the second-born son, the spare, didn't inherit anything because the idea was to keep land together. And then once the Industrial Revolution rolled in, land became a commodity. Once cities started to get bigger and bigger, that's when you started to chop up the land into little pieces and sell smaller parcels. And that's when land acquired this value that depended quite a lot on location, the sort of thing that we know today, like, what makes up for the price of a house? Location, location, location. So all of that was established in the 19th century. And so landowners, they often wanted some level of planning regulation because it affected the value of their property. So there were all these forces that combined together to create planning as we know it as a profession. And at the time, there was this whole crop of people that were concerned about what was happening in cities, and they started to propose new models. Some of these models were utopias, so fully designed cities, utopian cities. Some of the models were more meant to improve, regulate existing cities. And depending on the authors, some were forward-looking. They completely embraced technology. They said progress is unstoppable, so the future will be technological. We'll have cars in the cities, we'll have flying machines, we'll have robots, etc. So that's the cities they plan for. Some people were more backward-looking, as in advocating for a return to some past glory. So they located utopia in the past rather than the future. Well, what most of these people had in common, though, is that they were men. There were some women working in issues related to urban planning, but the women, it was rare that they would design whole plans, partly because they couldn't get any formal education in engineering and architecture. I mean, you need some technical education to even create a drawing, hold a ruler, and all of that. But the women were involved in things like, providing housing for migrants, new migrants to cities. There were crowds of rural migrants moving to cities. In North America, there was a mass of migrants from Europe. and some from Asia as well, but a lot from Europe, and they needed to adjust to this new context. And it was often small-scale women's organizations that dealt with integration of migrants, providing them with housing, teaching them how to be American, how to operate in this new society. In other cases, women managed housing, managed public housing. So there is this famous housing manager from the UK, Octavia Hill. She rented housing to poor tenants, and she saw that task not as the way people think of landlordism now, as a parasitic occupation where you're just extracting wealth from people that have no other options. Whereas she saw the task as, trying to work with her tenants, keep the rents low, teach them how to maintain the property, involve them, and so on and so forth. But her contributions, I mean, again, they didn't get recognized until much later. Whereas, so the women were doing this small scale contributions, whereas the men were designing these grand plans. And there are a few ways in which those grand plans of that era can be considered as masculine in character. I consider them as masculine as a planning researcher. So for one thing, they all apply these rigid forms, and the scale is often triumphal. Um, some some of the models designed do not have a triumphal scale. Say, for example, Ebenezer Howard's Garden City, that's a small self-contained city, but those are still very paternalistic sort of models. And then the majority of the plans from that era are just very, very grand in scale. Triumphal in this context means large, overblown cities, often having these broad pedestrian malls, ceremonial parade grounds, and so forth. So listeners from North America might think of Washington, D.C., the National Mall, that kind of style. Those were the types of plans that were being produced back then. And a lot of these planners, I mean, they sort of over overlay their plans with existing cities that had much more intricate, delicate tissue, urban built tissue. And where these plans were implemented, they were often, you can consider them as sort of devastating surgery. So cutting these broad boulevards through these delicate tissues that people had created over time, over centuries. And we see that everywhere. I mean, even contemporary Paris, that's how it was created, through that surgical approach, the medieval city being cut through by boulevards.
Well, when you're talking about large green spaces, which I like in general, but a lot of times we're getting back into that like class and race issue when you look at something like Central Park. Where Central Park is now in New York City was originally a thriving African American community that they basically just decimated, right? They just evicted everyone so that they could replace it with a green space that, the rich, predominantly white people could enjoy. Or I believe it was Los Angeles raised their Chinatown because they needed to build, I believe it was Union Station. So you see this over and over again where what's already there just gets wiped out in the name of quote unquote progress.
Yeah, progress, or sometimes, I mean, the resulting urban form may be beneficial, like an urban park. What would New York be without Central Park? But who benefited from that, and who suffered? We shouldn't forget that history. Another thing that we shouldn't forget is that a lot of these early planning ventures were bankrolled by colonialism, basically. So that's how a lot of countries in the North Atlantic, meaning Europe and the United States, that's how they had money to even contemplate doing urban plans at such grand scale that they started doing in 19th century, early 20th century. There was all this wealth coming in from the colonies, so the colonies were being exploited to the bone, and that's how people in the western part of the world, what's considered the West, that's how they got to live well. That's how they got to enjoy public transport systems, including subway systems, great parks like Central Park, public housing. So the idea of public housing, that's when it was planted in the profession in the 19th century. But that's how it could happen. That's how cities had money to even to implement that. We were taking from the colonies and giving to the metropole. So that's important not to forget because there is some version of feminism, um, decolonial feminism, that's very acutely aware of these issues. So this way of doing planning, where the financing comes from, it's definitely not in line with feminist principles in that sense.
Do you think there's a correlation between these grand structures and spaces that the men were putting forth and ego and insecurity? Because I feel like there is a lot of, particularly in younger cities when they are younger, right? So when we're talking about colonial cities like Sydney or Melbourne, feeling like they have to, I would say particularly in Australia where it's the whole, this was a convict colony, and feeling like they have to sort of prove themselves, right? They have to prove that they are as good as Europe, that they are quote unquote civilized, like that sort of insecurity and ego.
Absolutely, I think it is. I mean, I think it is. There is a bit of an inferiority complex manifest in those early plans for sure. But then at the individual level of the planners, I wonder. Sometimes I wonder if there was some level of pathology there. So all this mania for rigid geometries, straight lines, these broad vistas, order. I wonder if some of these early planners, they all suffer from OCD and they kind of express their pathologies in their work, and then everyone else had to go along.
Well, is it also that they see the European cities as the standard and like this is what a city looks like. And so, in order to be as good as them, we have to mimic them.
Oh yeah, yeah, absolutely. But the European city is reinvented in the 19th century because the European city of the medieval era was very different. If we compare medieval Asian cities, say Chinese cities, to medieval European cities, the Chinese cities are a lot more orderly, actually. You already see those perfect grids. The Forbidden City in Beijing with the palace at the center, and then the whole city is designed in these orderly grids. I mean, the population is really well controlled. Whereas European cities in the Middle Ages, partly because there was no centralized authority in Europe in the Middle Ages, like there was in China. So each city was kind of doing their own thing. They didn't have too many resources before colonialism. They didn't have too many resources to do grand plans like it had happened in the Roman Empire before. So the cities were really small and kind of very organic. So those weren't exactly the model for the colonies or North America. I mean, North America is a European colony in a sense. So 19th century European planning, that's what became the model.
And so, it seems like a lot of times I read about women who are doing social reform. So, they're basically taking very non-utopian cities, shall we say, that need fixing and they come in and do what they can to fix them, whether that's, someone like Jane Addams and Hull House or someone like Florence Sabin, who basically came in and sanitized Colorado, particularly Denver. So they, among other things, fixing up the sanitation systems that were in place, the public health care. So like you can see a dramatic drop in tuberculosis as a direct result of what she was doing. But it's very much, okay, look, if this stuff wasn't broken in the first place, these women wouldn't need to come in and fix it.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, They went in and fixed what needed fixing, the women, in a small scale. I mean, they did what they can, and it was an uphill battle. But some of them did propose some very revolutionary ideas, again, small scale. For example, the notion of cooperative housekeeping. It was a 19th century invention by women, or the kitchenless houses, or the centralized commercial food production and laundry facilities. Those ideas all came from women. And what do they mean? Well, to this day, I mean, I think I speak for a lot of women if I say that there is major frustration with housework, having to do piecemeal, and every woman having to repeat the same identical task that the woman next door is doing. And sometimes it's men that do the cooking nowadays. I mean, I'm not saying men don't participate, but we know from statistics that it's most often women. So it's like I'm cooking dinner in my home, the neighbor next door is cooking her dinner in her home. It's all very, very inefficient and gendered. So some of these early female thinkers, they were saying, well, why don't we create these co-ops at the small scale, say at the block scale, and the women kind of centralize the task. It's like one woman cooks for the whole block, and maybe they rotate, or that woman always has the task and charges the others. So not everyone is doing the same thing over and over and over, all this labor that sort of gets wasted. Or some of the women that were not so much into co-op, they were more kind of conservative, they liked commercial kind of relationships. They would say, well, these services could be centralized and be done by commercial enterprises. And I mean, nowadays we do have restaurants, but they're expensive. It's too expensive for people to eat out all the time. So they were talking about food production spaces that charge reasonable prices, not a lot more than what you spend if you bought your own groceries and did your own cooking at home. So these are all revolutionary, and laundry too. I mean, laundry was much more burdensome in the past when it was done by individual women before there were washing machines. But yeah, it takes up some time now as well. So those were some aspects. And then they were thinking about childcare as well. What to do about childcare, because that was a big part of women's lives that kept women in the home. Um, because of the lack of childcare, as in centralized childcare, a lot of women couldn't work even if they wanted to, or even if they had the education, the required education to enter the professions. A lot of them didn't, but even those who did, they just couldn't leave the children. There was no place. So again, it was these women thinkers envisioning solutions, small scale childcare, either at the neighborhood block or in more centralized facilities.
Now, when we're talking about sort of communalism versus the single family, and how this is very much a cultured thing as well, and it's very much something that sort of evolved because it used to be very normal in a lot of cultures for, like, for example, for adults to continue living at home
Oh,
until
yeah.
they moved out. But, for example, my parents and my brother and sister-in-law and their kids, they moved in together a few years ago. And,
Hmm.
I remember someone that
Yes.
I knew in high school was like, "Oh, that's so weird." And I'm like, "It's really not. It makes a lot of
No.
sense because my parents are in their 60s and, they're already providing a fair amount of childcare. And like this actually is a very logical structure. My parents don't need a three-story house that, they got when my brother and I were still teenagers. So, people's needs change, and this is actually very common in a lot of societies, just not in Indiana.
No, absolutely. Most societies have been tribal throughout history. So women lived in these traditional communities, and even though the daily task may have been gendered, but they weren't done at the individual level the way a lot of Western women do it. They were done at the communal level. So if you were a young mother with a baby, it's not like you had to provide for the baby, breastfeed, and clean the house, and do the cooking, and try to catch up with work, like get into phone calls here and there, and do all the other things that need to be done. You'd have your mother or a mother-in-law or a bunch of sisters or sisters-in-law that would pick up some of those tasks. So that has been normal for most of human civilization. This idea of the nuclear family, this is also recent, and it came with Industrial Revolution as well, because these young people that were able-bodied enough to work in the factories, they often moved from the countryside, from those traditional living arrangements. They moved into the big cities, and they were living there alone. And then eventually, when they got married, it was just them in the city. So they started to create all these nuclear families. But those were not necessarily all that great for women. I mean, in some sense, they were promoted as a liberation, because traditional families did have some drawbacks. I mean, we have to admit. So there were hierarchies within those families. So if you were a young woman, say a young daughter-in-law that had just been acquired from another family or another clan, you were pretty much at the bottom of the hierarchy, right? So women did not acquire status in the families until they had born children, possibly male children, and raised those children. Kind of they were older, and that's when they became sort of important within the family. So there was that problem, and then families also that veto marriages, who you could marry, what else you could do. But to go back to contemporary Indiana, those old constraints have all been removed, right? Families don't operate like that. Parents aren't vetoing their children's marriages. So I feel like now the ground is set to go back to some of those traditional arrangements, three generations living within the same house, because it has so much practical and financial advantage, that arrangement. And those old problems, like the very rigid hierarchy within the families, is no longer there. But yeah, women in the 19th century, I mean, to go back to that era and the connection to planning. So on one hand, planning at the time was framed as a progressive profession, looking at the cities of the future, what will be of human societies with industry, and so on. But then that came with sort of more extreme segregation between genders, and that's when this ideal of this feminine mystique, what later came to be known as feminine mystique, that's when it was created. So people heard of that when Betty Friedan wrote her famous book, but that was much later, in the 60s or 70s, that the concept became popularized. But really, the ideas about the angel in the house, the woman as the angel in the house, that was introduced in the 19th century. And one can see that this is positive for women. I mean, they're being called an angel. What's better about that? They're putting you on a pedestal. Your husband loves you. You're his angel. But the reality was that these kind of euphemisms were really meant to convince women that their place was in the home, so that they could create sort of a stable domestic environment for the man when he came back from work. So that's the societal context. But how did this translate into space, into the urban context, the physical context of the city? Well, it translated into zoning and functional segregation of land uses. So that's when we started to have neighborhoods that were zoned formally or informally. Zoning became formal in early 20th century, but there was informal zoning earlier than that. So some neighborhoods would be completely residential over here, with these angels of the house taking care of the neighborhood. And then some neighborhoods became the places of business, the public sphere. So private sphere, public sphere, they became completely separate. The public sphere was for men to go to work and come back home, and the private sphere was for women. And so That's why I say that the early transport systems were also masculine in character because that's how they emerged. They emerged to connect residential suburbs to a CBD where the men went to work. So they were meant to serve the needs of these male commuters rather than the trips of women during the day, taking care of the household. So that's what happened, and that had not been the case. I mean, we need to understand that this is a 19th century invention, this complete separation of the public and private sphere. Because in the past, it was often the case that work, commerce, and living all happened within the same, under the same roof, within the same house. So people would have some kind of workshop on the ground floor in the back of their building and then sell the goods in the front. So the frontage needed to be connected to the street, and then they lived on top. So that was a very, very common setup in Europe, but then in Asia, Africa, a lot of places, that's how work and living was arranged. And that was so much better for women, of course, because you could have the children around the house all day, and you didn't need to take them to a childcare place and then pick them up again the way we have it organized now. So in some sense, planning, the kind of planning that happened, the early planning, um, it made things worse for women. I mean, was meant to make things better, but it actually made things worse for women.
I think that really speaks to when you don't include women in the conversation, men just doing what they think is best for women. And it's like, no, actually, isolating us in the suburbs is not good for our mental health, especially if you're trapped with a child all day. And I don't mean that to sound in any way offensive to mothers, but when you are isolated, and particularly when you are isolated with a small child, that only exacerbates a lot of the stress of being isolated in the first place.
I would even frame it a little bit differently. The problem is not having choices, right? Having these very prescribed social roles. You can only do this. So if someone wants to be a mother and raise a small child, and that's fulfilling to them, that's perfectly fine, and they need to be supported by planning structures accordingly. But if that's not what they want to do, but they're being told that's their only option. That's what I don't like. And there no structures, planning structures to support any other choice. I mean, I see that as very, very problematic. Convincing people, sort of brainwashing them, this is really your role. I mean, you're biologically meant to do this. Can't you see you have this delicate physical structure? You have a womb. Nature meant for you to be at home. So that's what I see as not being okay.
Well, that issue of choice and women's increasing options and independence, obviously not all women, there are things holding a lot of different women back depending on their circumstances. But that also struck me when you were talking about communal living and this idea of a young woman or even a girl being in a marriage that maybe she didn't have a whole lot of choice in the first place, and now she's sort of under the command of her mother-in-law. And I just can't imagine that that is as much of an issue for most women today. I'm not saying it doesn't happen at all ever, but we are less trapped in many ways, most of us are,
Absolutely.
than we would have been at that time. So I can tell you for a fact, my sister-in-law is not in any way under my mom's thumb.
No, exactly. No, all of those issues have have been made better. But there is this strand of feminist planning that looks at the connection between housing and gender. And we do see that there are still lots of constraints there. For example, this is not the case in the US portion, it's not the case in Australia, but there are still parts of the world where to gain access to mortgage financing, you need to be married or have some male cosign on the mortgage, the money that you borrow. So that places constraints on women's independence as in housing independence. For example, that's one type of problem. Another type of problem can be how physically secure housing is. So is it in a good neighborhood? As in good neighborhood meaning a low crime kind of neighborhood, the neighborhood where the woman feels like she can walk by herself in the evening, she can walk her dog, or she can allow her kids to play outside. So that's one type of housing barrier, right? If the woman is too poor and needs to go and live in a neighborhood that's not physically safe for her. So there's still issues there, housing issues that affect women more than men.
Well, there's also things like the gender pay gap that just mean women, on average, have less income than men do.
Exactly. So that creates a barrier in the housing market or even the transport market. I mean, it's expensive to own a car. We're crunching the numbers now with a group of colleagues to figure out exactly how much it costs the individual and society for every car ownership. And it costs a lot of money to own a car. So if you don't earn so much money in the first place, that transport choice or necessity, really, cars are often not even a choice for people, but that transport necessity makes you so much poorer.
And then you can easily get into a cycle where the only car you can afford is not dependable and may in fact cost more money over time because you constantly have to get it repaired. And then, what if you lose your job because your car broke down because you couldn't afford a more reliable car? And just the level of precarity that so many people live in where something like reliable public transport or, cities that are designed to allow us to live in the same areas that we work in would reduce that precarity.
Well, there is a strong connection between housing costs and transport costs, right? If you end up living in some place that's very far removed from employment centers, over time, you'll end up spending so much more on transport, reaching your job or any destination, really. So if people have less income, and women on average do, then it means that they're spending so much more on transport, percentage of income.
I think this is also why remote work, like one of many reasons that I'm a huge fan of remote work, is that not least because you're reducing that cost in transport. So I remember after the COVID lockdowns started dying down and my employer wanted us all to come back into the office, and I said, okay, I am spending the equivalent, this was in Sydney, I'm spending the equivalent of a full workday every week just getting to and from the office. It was a 45-minute commute 5 times a week. I was also spending the equivalent of an hour's worth of my pay on public transport. And I laid this out for them. I was like, I am losing more than a day's worth of my life and income getting into the office where I do not need to be. My title was digital marketing coordinator. It's right there in the name, guys. And there's a difference between saying, okay, 1 day a week versus every single day. But the only reason that a lot of people move to cities in the first place is because that's where the jobs are, which, if you can work remotely, isn't the case. Like, you don't even have to live in Sydney, in my case.
No, of course. And I mean, as we're recording this, the election in Australia is in full swing, and there have been some proposals to require public sector employees to return to the office full time by some political parties. I mean, some oppose it, some support the idea. And the biggest backlash to the proposal has come from women's groups. Because they want the flexibility. They want the flexibility, and they need the flexibility more than men. Women do because of their various responsibilities in addition to work. And if you think about it, so I was talking about in the pre-industrial era, a lot of activities happening under the same roof, people not needing to commute at all. The concept of the commute didn't exist until the Industrial Revolution. So, in a sense, work from home is a return to that era that was so much better for women in so many ways.
Are
It's
you
not even a new thing.
Are you familiar with the movie 9 to 5?
Yes, I am.
Okay.
Yes, I am. And I actually present it to my students when I talk about feminist planning. I say, well, um, women used to live in these traditional communities. Then we had um, the market and the state convince us that, oh, we should be individuals now. Forget the family, forget the support structures. Let's be individuals. Move on to the world. You know, that was the idea of modernism. Leave the past behind, tradition behind, bigotry and backwardness. And we'll look into the future. The future is individualistic. And then the state and the market sort of convinced women, they said, we'll take care of you. You don't need the family. We'll take care of you. We'll provide you an old age pension. We'll provide childcare. We'll provide you with sick leave and this and that. Um, and the other, and women bought it. I mean, that's when we started to have, yeah, individualism rise among women and the nuclear family and everything else. But then what kind of deal did women get? They got a pretty raw deal. They got jobs like the ones depicted in 9 to 5 with these very rigid schedules. And how do you manage the rest of your life? How do you manage children with that kind of job, right? Or we have these concepts promoted, like the fact that women can join the military now. In a lot of countries, that's also promoted as, you know, this big achievement. Finally, you know, women can be same as men. They can go to work to war and be killed and lose their limbs. And I'm like, is that the ideal we're fighting for? I mean, I'd like it if men didn't have to make those sacrifices either.
And there's a whole other conversation to be had about women advocating for peace across, I mean, centuries. But the reason I thought of 9 to 5 is that, spoiler for anyone who hasn't seen the movie, I mean, you can pause this and go watch the movie. It's very good. I highly recommend it. But these three women, played by Dolly Parton, Jane Fonda, and Lily Tomlin, are fed up with their misogynistic asshole boss, and they kind of accidentally kidnap him. Like they accidentally drug him and then accidentally kidnap him. It makes sense. Just go watch the movie. But while he's out of commission, they implement all of these changes. So there's things like flexible work hours, and I think job sharing is one of them. And they've got on-site childcare, and they've basically brought that female lens to what do your employees need? And they're talking about, oh, absenteeism is down, worker satisfaction is up, da 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 da. It's working, right? Like that's the whole point of that scene is we made these changes, everyone is happier, and the workplace is more productive. And so often when I hear stories about how we still can't seem to accomplish these things today, I'm like, Dolly and Jane and Lily told you what we needed decades ago, and we still don't have these things. What the hell?
Yeah, and in a sense, those things are trivial when you think about it. The need is to advocate for much more systemic, you know, radical changes. Though those things were small cosmetic improvements. I mean, they worked, they improved. All these people was working day by quite a lot, but it is absurd that they cannot be implemented. But you know, that movie, I mean, it reminds me of, you know, some of the writings of Karl Marx. Not that he was the greatest feminist out there, but even he had said that the point is not for women to join the toil of men in the factories, right? That's not much of a liberation. And 9 to 5, the movie, it depicts a situation where women have just joined the toil of men. So there were those men, the commuters of the 1950s, you know, the old movies where they show the commuters all wearing hats and these formal suits, all going to work together and coming back at the same time. And then by the 60s, 70s, the women had joined that toil and it clearly wasn't working. That's why that movie was made in the first place, to critique that reality.
And I think especially with the technological advances that we've made since that movie was made, it feels like with improvements and increases in technology, there's even less excuse to not make changes that benefit workers.
Yes, and technology. I mean, I critiqued it quite a lot, 19th century, what technology did to cities, industrialization, and also for transport infrastructure. But technology, in particular internet technology, that's what I think has made the feminist movement so much more popular because people can find information about the movement online very easily. And I think that's a big reason why a lot more women are actually joining in.
So you've mentioned Octavia Hill previously in the conversation, but obviously there are other women that you talk about in the book. So can you give us an idea of how is urban planning different when women are involved, or if they were ever actually in charge? God help us all.
Well, I think if women were in charge, we'd probably make better environmental decisions, for one thing. There has been research showing that if you have city councils that are dominated by women, the decisions that are made are more friendly to the environment, as in planning decisions or decisions around development infrastructure, construction, and so on. So there is that. And then there is also research that shows that women generally are less conservative than men, so a lot of social outcomes would also be better. And I'm thinking here of social infrastructure like community centers and um, childcare centers, libraries. These are physical infrastructure. They're also community infrastructure. To some level, women read more than men on average, so maybe we'd have more libraries if women were in charge. And some of these differences, I mean, they might not be biological, as in, essentialist differences between men and women. It might be simply a function of socialization. They found themselves in the situations where they constantly had to be more flexible, rely on natural resource more, and that's what's made us more eco-friendly. So it could be just socialization, something that men themselves have created, right? In that sense, but that's the situation. That's what we have now. And when it comes to public participation, I mean, that goes without saying. If you plan for any group, even if you plan for children who don't have their full reasoning skills yet, but if you plan facilities for children, it's a good idea to involve children. Go and talk to them, have workshops that um, are at their level of understanding, of course. But it's not a bad idea at all. If you want to improve a school, say a playground, go and talk to the local kids, see what they're up to, see how they play, how they use space. I mean, and if that's the case for children, that's certainly the case for adult women. You need to ask them what their needs are if you're going to plan for them.
Join us next time on the Infinite Women podcast, and remember, well-behaved women rarely make history.